The Alpha King chose her sister at the ceremony, so she disappeared carrying his twins. The night of the choosing ceremony, the sky over Blackthorn territory was clear enough to see every star, and the moon hung low and full, the way it always did on nights that decided people's whole lives. Torches lined the stone courtyard in front of the pack house, and the fire from each one bent slightly in the wind, like they were bowing to something bigger than themselves. Hundreds of pack members stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. Somewhere in the middle of that crowd, not on the raised platform where she used to imagine herself standing, stood Ilara. She was 24 years old, plain in the way people call a girl plain when they haven't actually looked at her. And she had spent the last 3 months of her life convincing herself that tonight would end differently than she feared. She wore a simple green dress, nothing fancy, because nobody had told her to dress for anything. Nobody expected her to be chosen, except her. Because Ilara knew something the rest of the pack didn't. She and Kian, the Alpha King himself, had a history that had never once touched daylight. It started nearly a year earlier, in a season that felt, looking back, almost like it happened to someone else. He'd found her by the creek that ran along the eastern border, sitting alone, with her knees pulled to her chest, the way she did when the noise of her family's house became too much. He hadn't said anything grand, he just sat down near her, not too close, and asked what kind of person comes out here at night to be sad by herself. That was how it started. Quiet nights, long walks nobody saw, words traded in low voices under trees that kept their secrets. He told her things he never said out loud to anyone else. That the crown felt like a weight sewn into his skin, that he was tired of being looked at like a symbol instead of a person, that when he was with her, for once, he didn't feel like the Alpha King, he just felt like Kian. And somewhere in all those quiet nights, something had bloomed between them that neither of them planned for, and neither of them could explain to anyone else. A bond, not the official kind, not the kind blessed by pack law and announced under moonlight in front of witnesses, but real all the same. The kind that lives in a person's chest whether or not anyone gives it permission to exist. He had told her, more than once, in more than one version, that when the time came, she was the one he would choose. She believed him. That was maybe the simplest and most devastating part of the whole story. She believed him completely, the way people believe things that make their whole world make sense. So she stood in that crowd tonight, not on the platform, wearing a green dress nobody had told her to wear up, and she waited for her name. Celine, her older sister, stood near the front, glowing under torchlight the way Celine always seemed to glow under everything. She had golden hair, an easy laugh, the kind of face people wrote songs about without meaning to. She had been raised, quite literally raised, to be chosen. Their mother used to say it plainly, at dinner, in front of both girls, like it was simply a fact of nature. Celine was born for the front of the room, and Ilara was born to stand somewhere behind her and be grateful for the view. Ilara had spent years making peace with that sentence. She thought she had. Then Kian stepped forward, dressed in the dark formal clothes of a king making the most important decision of his rule, and the whole courtyard went so silent that Ilara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the small, ridiculous rustle of her dress against her legs, could hear everything except the one thing she needed to hear, which was some kind of warning. He said a name, he said Celine. For one full second, Ilara's brain simply refused the information. She thought she had misheard. She thought maybe there were two ceremonies happening, some strange trick of sound where names got crossed in the wind. But then she watched her sister's face crack open into surprise and then joy, watched Celine's hand fly to her own mouth, watched the crowd erupt into the kind of noise that only happens when several hundred people witness a fairy tale finishing itself in real time. Kian did not look for her in the crowd. That was the detail Ilara would return to later, again and again, turning it over like a stone in her pocket. He did not scan the faces looking for hers. He did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not do any of the small human things a person does when they are about to break someone's heart in public and know it. He simply reached for Celine's hand. Ilara did not scream. She did not cry out or run from the courtyard the way heartbreak looks in the stories people tell each other. Instead, something in her went very still, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but is closer to what an animal feels right before it understands it needs to run. Her pulse pounded loud in her own ears and nowhere else, like the rest of the world had gone soft and far away, and only her body remained loud and present, and screaming quietly to itself. She noticed, in that strange suspended moment, that her shoes were the wrong shoes for running. She had worn thin, flat sandals, not boots, and some absurd corner of her mind fixed on that fact and refused to let it go, as if her shoes were the actual emergency of the evening. She did not know yet, standing there, that she was already carrying two hearts inside her own. She had known for 11 days. She had told no one. She had been waiting, she realized now with a cold clarity, for a night just like this one, a night when Kian would stand in front of everyone and make it safe for her to finally say the truth out loud. That safety had just been chosen by someone else. The ceremony continued around her in a blur of cheering and torchlight and Celine's radiant, disbelieving face. People clapped Ilara on the shoulder in passing, not unkindly, simply because they didn't know, congratulating her the way you congratulate the family of the bride. She smiled at them. She does not remember, later, how she managed that. She only remembers walking home that night alone, her sandals slapping quietly against the stone path, and deciding, somewhere between the pack house and her family's door, that she would not stay to watch what came next. She left before dawn. She did not pack much. A bag with a few changes of clothes, whatever coin she'd saved from small jobs around the territory, a blanket, and the letter she almost wrote to her mother and then didn't, because there was nothing in her that wanted to explain herself to a family that had never once asked what she wanted. She left through the back gate, the one used mostly by hunters returning late, and she did not look back at the pack house, its torches now burned down to embers, its courtyard empty of everyone who did not know her secret. She walked for hours before the sun came up. Then she found a cart heading toward the southern trade roads and paid the driver everything she could spare to let her ride in the back among sacks of grain, and she did not speak to him, and he did not ask her anything, which she was grateful for more than she could say. By the time the pack noticed she was missing, she had already crossed one border. By the time anyone thought to look properly, she had crossed two more. It would be years before Blackthorn territory heard her name again. The stories that circulated afterward, in the quiet way pack gossip always finds its channels, said that the Alpha King searched harder for the missing girl than anyone expected a new king to search for anyone who was not his chosen mate. Some said he sent trackers out for months. Some said he went himself, more than once, disappearing from his own territory for days at a time without explanation, coming back looking like a man who had lost something and could not say what, because saying it would mean admitting a truth his new wife did not deserve to hear. Nobody in the pack understood why. A king who chose one woman searching that hard for another was the kind of story that didn't add up cleanly, and so most people simply stopped trying to make it add up and let it become one more strange rumor about a strange private king. Ilara, for her part, was building an entirely different life 2 territories away, in a small human town that didn't know or care about packs or moons or alpha bloodlines. She rented a room above a bakery from an older woman named Bertha, who asked no questions and offered, on the very first night, a warm loaf of bread and a bed that didn't smell like anyone else's grief. Ilara took work where she could find it, mending clothes, minding a neighbor's children, sweeping floors at the tavern down the street, and she learned, slowly, how to be a person whose name meant nothing to anyone. It was strange at first, how much relief there was in that. Nobody looked at her and thought, the girl the king didn't choose. Nobody looked at her at all, really, and there were nights she cried from the sheer unbearable lightness of being invisible, and other nights she cried from how much that same invisibility ached, like a wound that wouldn't close. She gave birth in the depth of winter, in the small room above the bakery, with Bertha and the town's aging midwife as her only company. It was a hard birth, long and frightening, made harder by the fact that there was no pack healer, no herbs bred specifically for wolf mothers, none of the things Blackthorn women were promised at every birth since before anyone could remember. Alara gritted her teeth through hours of pain with nothing but a human midwife's steady hands and Bertha's voice telling her to breathe. Just breathe. Almost there. Then, near dawn, the midwife's face changed. "There's another one," she said, and Alara, exhausted past the point of fear, simply nodded, because some distant part of her had always known. Twins. Of course it was twins. Nothing about this pregnancy had ever done anything the simple way. 2 babies were born that morning, a boy and a girl, both small and furious, and loud in the way newborns are loud when they've just discovered air. Alara held them both, one in each arm, too tired to cry, too overwhelmed to do anything except stare at their faces and try to memorize them, though of course she would never forget them, not for one single day of what came after. It was Bertha who noticed the marks first, a week later, while helping bathe them, a birthmark, small and pale, shaped unmistakably like a crescent moon with a small break at its center, the mark of the Draeth bloodline, known across every territory that had ever heard of Blackthorn's ruling family. Bertha didn't ask where it came from. She simply looked at Alara for a long moment, then looked back down at the twins and said only, "Well, that explains some things." Alara spent the next several years raising 2 children who could not fully hide what they were. She taught them, as soon as they were old enough to understand anything, to keep their eyes down around strangers, because a wolf pup's eyes sometimes flash gold when their temper flares, and gold eyes on human children draw exactly the kind of attention a hiding mother cannot afford. She taught them to control their shifts before their bodies were even fully capable of controlling anything, out of necessity rather than choice, because a 5-year-old who turns into a wolf in the middle of a bakery has no good explanation ready for the neighbors. She built, out of nothing, a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Market days, scraped knees, a small wooden table where the 3 of them ate dinner together every night, her son telling wild stories about things he swore he saw in the forest, her daughter quietly correcting every exaggerated detail with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage. There were birthdays with small cakes Bertha helped bake. There were nights Alara sat by their beds, long after they'd fallen asleep, simply watching them breathe, still not quite believing they were real, still not quite believing she had managed, against every reasonable expectation, to keep them safe. But safety, she would learn, is rarely something a person gets to keep forever without a fight. The twins were nearly 7 when the first sign of trouble came. It arrived quietly, the way real trouble usually does, not as a dramatic confrontation but as a stranger who lingered a little too long near the bakery, asking Bertha idle questions about the woman who rented the room upstairs and her 2 children. Bertha, sharper than her age suggested, gave nothing away, but she told Alara about it that same evening, her voice low and careful. "He wasn't from around here," Bertha said. "Didn't smell like the market folk either." She didn't need to say more than that. Alara understood immediately what kind of stranger asks careful questions and smells wrong to a woman who has lived beside wolves long enough to notice such things. It was a rogue pack, Alara would learn later, one of several loosely organized groups that made a business out of finding valuable secrets and selling them to whoever paid best. And 2 children with the unmistakable mark of the Draeth bloodline, hidden for years outside their own territory, was about as valuable a secret as existed in that part of the world. Whether the rogues meant to sell the information back to Blackthorn, or to use the twins themselves as leverage against a king, Alara didn't wait to find out. She had one option left, and she knew it the moment Bertha told her about the stranger. She could keep running, alone, further and further from every place she had ever known, dragging 2 frightened children behind her toward some new town where the same danger would eventually catch up again. Or she could walk back through Blackthorn's gates on her own terms, before anyone else dragged her children through them by force. She chose to walk back. The journey home took 11 days. Alara did not tell the twins everything, only enough, that they were going to a place where people like them were common, where they would not need to hide their eyes or their tempers, where their mother had grown up before certain things happened that she would explain when they were older. Her son found this thrilling. Her daughter found it suspicious, in the quiet, watchful way she found most new information suspicious, and she held her mother's hand tighter than usual as they walked the final stretch of road toward the territory Ilara had once fled in the middle of the night wearing the wrong shoes. The blackthorn border smelled exactly the way Ilara remembered it, pine and riverstone, and something underneath that was simply the smell of home, whether she wanted it to be or not. She walked through the gates, not as the frightened girl who had disappeared years earlier, but as a woman who had clearly survived something enormous, and the guards at the gate seemed to sense this before she said a single word. They did not stop her, they simply stared, then sent someone running ahead to alert the pack house, because whatever had just walked back through their border was not a small event, and everyone with wolf instincts sharp enough to notice knew it. Word spread through the territory faster than Ilara could walk the distance to the pack house courtyard. By the time she arrived, a crowd had already gathered, drawn by whispers of a woman returning from nowhere, with 2 children who had the alpha bloodline stamped plainly on their small faces. It was the same courtyard where the choosing ceremony had happened years earlier. The torches were different, the season was different, but the stones underfoot were the same stones Ilara had once walked away from in the dark. Kian came out of the pack house before anyone summoned him, as though some part of him had already known, the way a person sometimes knows a storm is coming, before the sky gives any actual sign. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard. He looked at Ilara first, older now, steadier, her face carrying the particular calm of someone who has already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and something crossed his expression that the crowd would talk about for a long time afterward, though none of them could quite agree on what to call it. Then his gaze moved down, to the 2 children standing close beside her, and Ilara watched the exact moment the crescent-shaped mark on her son's wrist caught the torchlight. Whatever Kian had built his life around, in the years since the ceremony broke apart in that single second, silently, in front of his entire pack. He did not say anything at first. He simply walked forward, slow, like a man crossing ground he wasn't sure would hold his weight, and knelt down in front of the twins, at their level, the way you approach something you are afraid might vanish if you move too fast. "What are your names?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he probably intended. Ilara's son, never one to be shy, answered first, chin up, entirely unafraid. Her daughter said nothing, only studied Kian's face with the same careful suspicion she studied everything, as if deciding for herself whether this stranger deserved any trust at all. Celine was there too, somewhere near the edge of the crowd, and Ilara caught sight of her sister's face across the courtyard, pale, stunned, clearly working through years of a story she'd been told that had just revealed itself to be missing several important chapters. Ilara did not look at her with anger. There was no version of anger that made sense to aim at Celine, who had been handed a version of events at the ceremony just as false, in its own way, as the version that had broken Ilara's heart. It simply happened to be a different lie than the one Ilara had lived inside. Kian rose slowly to his feet and finally looked at Ilara directly, and the courtyard around them had gone so quiet that even the wind seemed to be listening. "You should have told me," he said, quiet, not accusing, just tired in the specific way a person is tired when they realize how much time has been wasted on a mistake that could have been fixed years earlier. "You didn't ask," Ilara said. "You never once looked for me in that crowd." There was nothing he could say to that which would not sound like an excuse, and to his credit, he didn't try. He simply stood there, in front of his pack, in front of his wife, in front of 2 children who were unmistakably his own, and let the truth exist in the open air where everyone could finally see it clearly. What happened after that did not resolve itself neatly in a single evening, the way stories sometimes pretend such things can. There were long private conversations that the pack never heard the details of. There were arguments, and there was grief that belonged to more than one person in that courtyard, and there was a slow, careful process of figuring out what came next for 2 children who had grown up entirely outside the world that was, undeniably, theirs by blood. But Ilara did not come back begging for a throne, and she made that clear from the very first conversation. She came back to protect her children, and having done that, she found herself, for the first time since that torchlit night years earlier, in a position where the choices were actually hers to make. Whether to stay, whether to let the twins know their father and on what terms, whether to ever again let herself trust a promise made under a full moon. The story ends not with Elara standing beside Kian in some grand reunited image, and not with a crown placed on her head to correct an old wrong. It ends with something smaller and, in its own way, sturdier. Elara standing in the same courtyard where her whole life once broke apart, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, her son's fingers curled loosely around her other hand, and her own 2 feet planted firmly on ground that, for once, she had chosen to stand on herself. Whatever came next, whatever arrangement eventually formed between a king who had chosen wrong once and a woman who had built an entire life out of the wreckage of that choice, one thing about the ending remained certain and unshaken. Elara was no longer the girl who stood quietly in a crowd, waiting for someone else to say her name and decide her worth. She had already decided it herself, somewhere along a road with the wrong shoes on her feet, in a rented room above a bakery, in the eyes of 2 children who never once doubted, not for a single day of their lives, that their mother was exactly enough.